The quiet courage of Shetlands Larsen. Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Leif Larsen, a man who was called Shetlands Larsen for his crossings over the North Sea. His is a story of quiet determination, of a sailor who became one of the most decorated resistance heroes of the Second World War, and yet remained humble throughout his extraordinary life. As we settle in together, let us journey back to a time when the seas were dark and dangerous, and one man's courage helped light the way to freedom. Our story begins in the early years of the 20th century, in a Norway still young as an independent nation. Leif Andreas Larsen was born on January 19, 1906, in the small coastal town of Rødberg, in the Hvaler archipelago near the mouth of the Oslo fjord. This was a place where the sea was not merely a backdrop to life, but life itself, where the rhythm of waves and the turning of tides marked the passage of time more surely than any clock. The waters around Hvaler are beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Here, granite islands rise from the sea like ancient monuments, their surfaces smoothed by millennia of wind and wave. Channels and straits wind between them, and a sailor must know these waters intimately to navigate them safely. It was in this maritime world that young Leif grew up, the son of a ship's captain with the salt wind in his lungs and the movement of boats in his blood. From his earliest years, Leif was drawn to the sea. While other children played on the shore, he was already learning the craft that would define his life. He learned to read the water, to understand how currents moved around the islands, how the wind spoke through different tones and touches. He learned to respect the sea, never to underestimate it, and to work with it rather than against it. These lessons, absorbed slowly through childhood and adolescence, would later prove invaluable in ways the young boy could never have imagined. By the time he was a young man, Leif had chosen his path without hesitation. He would be a sailor like his father before him, but Leif wanted more than to sail the familiar waters of his homeland. He wanted to test himself against the open ocean, to see distant ports and foreign shores. And so, in the way of Norwegian sailors for generations, he went to sea. The years between the wars were good ones for a capable Norwegian sailor. Norway had one of the world's great merchant fleets, and Norwegian sailors were prized for their skill and reliability. Leif worked his way up through the ranks, moving from ship to ship, learning not just seamanship but the many trades that make a sailor complete. He became expert in navigation both by instruments and by the older arts of reading stars and weather. He learned engines and could coax machinery to work when it seemed determined to fail. He understood the structure of ships, knew which sounds were normal and which spelled danger. Most importantly, perhaps, he developed the temperament of a true seaman. He learned patience, the patience to wait for the right moment, to not force a situation when the sea was teaching a different lesson. He learned decisiveness too, the ability to act quickly when action was needed, to make the right choice even when information was incomplete and time was short. And he learned something else, something harder to name, a kind of intimate conversation with the sea itself, a feeling for how wind and wave and current would interact, an intuition that seemed almost supernatural but was really the accumulation of thousands of hours of careful attention. He sailed the North Sea countless times, that stern body of water that lies between Norway and the British Isles. The North Sea is not the largest ocean, not the deepest, but it is one of the most demanding. Its weather is famously unpredictable, capable of changing from relative calm to life-threatening storm in a matter of hours. Its waters are cold year-round, cold enough to kill a man in minutes, and it is busy with traffic, full of shipping lanes and fishing grounds requiring constant vigilance from those who traverse it. Leif learned every mood of the North Sea. He learned to read the particular gray of the sky that presaged a storm, the texture of the waves that indicated a change in wind direction. He learned where the currents ran strong and where they were weak, where the water was deep and where sudden shallows lurked. He learned the landmarks of the Norwegian coast and the Scottish islands, the particular profiles of headlands and the distinctive patterns of lights that marked harbors and hazards. He became, in short, a master of his craft. And then, in the spring of 1940, everything changed. April 9th, 1940 dawned like any other day in Norway, but by its end the nation's world had been turned upside down. German forces invaded in a coordinated assault that caught the country almost entirely by surprise. By the time the sun set, German troops controlled Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. The Nazi war machine had swept into neutral Norway with devastating speed and efficiency. The Norwegian government and royal family fled north, eventually escaping to Britain to continue the fight from exile. But for most Norwegians, there was no escape. They woke up in a free country and went to sleep in an occupied one, and the occupation would last for 5 long years. For Leif Larsen, the invasion caught him in Bergen, Norway's great western port city. He watched as German warships entered the harbor, as Wehrmacht soldiers marched through streets where Norwegians had walked in freedom just hours before. He felt the same shock, anger, and despair that gripped his countrymen. But unlike many, Leif was a sailor with intimate knowledge of the waters between Norway and Britain, and he began to think. The distance from Norway to Scotland is not vast. At its narrowest, perhaps 300 nautical miles of open ocean. It is a challenging crossing, yes, especially in small boats, but not impossible for a skilled sailor. And if one could make that crossing, one could reach free territory, could join the fight against the occupiers. More than that, one could potentially make the journey multiple times, could create a link between occupied Norway and free Britain. These thoughts turned in Leif's mind through the confused spring of 1940, as Norway's brief resistance was crushed and the reality of occupation settled over the country like a shroud. He was not alone in such thinking. Other Norwegian sailors, fishermen, and boat owners were reaching similar conclusions. Norway had a long tradition of independence, and Norwegians were not inclined to accept subjugation meekly. In the early summer of 1940, Leif Larsen made his decision. He would go to Britain. He would join the Norwegian forces in exile. He would fight. The escape was not simple. The Norwegian coast was now patrolled by German vessels, and any boat attempting to leave had to do so in secrecy. But Leif had advantages. He knew the waters intimately, knew the thousands of islands and inlets and hiding places along Norway's convoluted coastline. He knew the patterns of weather, when fog might provide cover, when storms might keep patrol boats in port. He found a boat, not a large vessel, just a fishing boat, but sturdy and seaworthy. He gathered supplies, fuel, charts, and carefully planned his route. Then, choosing his moment, he slipped away from the Norwegian coast. The crossing was everything he had anticipated and worse. The North Sea that summer showed him no favors, throwing up storms and fog, testing him hour after hour. But Leif's years of experience held him in good stead. He navigated through darkness and poor visibility, finding his way by compass and dead reckoning when stars and landmarks were invisible. He nursed his engine through rough seas, made constant small adjustments to his course to account for wind and current. He stayed alert through exhaustion, knowing that a moment's inattention could mean disaster. And finally, after what must have seemed an eternity, he saw the dark line of the Shetland Islands appearing from the mist. He had made it. The Shetland Islands, that remote Scottish archipelago that stands between Scotland and Norway, became Leif's new base. Here, Norwegian refugees were gathering, and here the British and Norwegian authorities were beginning to organize resistance operations. Leif's arrival and his demonstrated ability to make the crossing was noted with great interest. What became known as the Shetland bus was already forming when Leif Larsen arrived, though it would take time to develop into a full operation. The concept was simple but dangerous. Use fishing boats and other small vessels to make clandestine crossings between Shetland and Norway, transporting agents, weapons, and supplies into occupied territory, and bringing out refugees and intelligence on the return journey. The operation was needed desperately. Norway's resistance movement required weapons and explosives, radios, and other equipment. Intelligence agents needed to be inserted into the country. And there were refugees, political figures, resistance members in danger of capture, people who had to get out, who needed escape routes. The Shetland bus would provide all these services. But the challenges were immense. The crossings had to be made in small boats that could navigate the Norwegian fjords and not attract too much attention. These same boats then had to survive the North Sea crossing, which could be brutal even in summer and was nearly suicidal in winter. The boats had to evade German patrols, which grew more numerous and vigilant as the Germans realized that traffic was moving between Norway and Britain. Weather in the North Sea is treacherous, navigation is difficult, and the water is cold enough that capsizing means death in minutes. Despite all this, the operation began. Norwegian sailors began making the crossing in fishing boats, motor launches, and whatever seaworthy craft they could obtain. Some made it across, some didn't. The casualty rate was horrifying, especially in the early years. Boats were lost to storms, to German fire, to mechanical failure in the middle of the ocean. Brave men set out and never returned, swallowed by the dark waters of the North Sea. But some boats made it across again and again, and one skipper above all others proved himself capable of defying the odds. Leif Larsen. It was during these crossings that Leif Andreas Larsen acquired the name by which he would be known for the rest of his life. Shetlands Larsen. The nickname captured something essential about him: his inseparable connection to these dangerous voyages across the North Sea. His mastery of the route between Shetland and Norway. Leif quickly established himself as the most successful and reliable of the Shetland bus skippers. While other boats were lost, his returned. While other skippers struggled with navigation and weather, Leif seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to find his way through fog and storm, to avoid German patrols, to bring his boat and passengers safely home. His success was not supernatural, of course. It was the product of skill, experience, and extraordinary attention to detail. Before each crossing, Leif prepared meticulously. He studied weather reports and patterns, chose his timing carefully. He maintained his vessel personally, ensuring every system was reliable. He planned routes that took advantage of the North Sea's complex currents and weather patterns. And during crossings, he remained constantly alert, making hundreds of small decisions that collectively meant the difference between success and failure, life and death. He also possessed remarkable physical endurance. Crossings often took 2 or 3 days, sometimes more in bad weather or when evasive action was needed. Throughout these journeys, Leif would remain on deck or in the wheelhouse, snatching only brief moments of sleep. He couldn't afford to rest properly. The sea and the enemy both demanded constant vigilance. Yet somehow he endured, crossing after crossing, maintaining his edge when exhaustion should have dulled it. And there was courage, of course. To make one such crossing required bravery. To make them repeatedly, knowing the odds, knowing how many boats and men had been lost, required something more. Leif made crossing after crossing, mission after mission, sailing into danger again and again. His reputation grew, both among the Norwegian resistance members he transported and supplied, and among the German forces that sought to stop the Shetland bus operations. The Germans came to know certain boats and skippers, came to respect and fear their skill. Leif Larsen was at the top of their list of targets. Through 1941 and 1942, the missions continued. Each followed a similar pattern, yet each was unique, presenting its own challenges and dangers. A typical mission might begin with a briefing in Scalloway, the small Shetland fishing port that served as the main base for the Shetland bus. Leif would learn what needed to be transported, perhaps weapons and explosives for a sabotage operation, perhaps a resistance organizer being inserted back into Norway, perhaps radio equipment for intelligence gathering. He would learn the destination, usually a remote fjord or island on the Norwegian coast where contact could be made with resistance members. Then came the preparation. Cargo was carefully loaded and secured. Everything had to be protected from seawater and arranged so the boat remained properly balanced. Fuel tanks were topped off, engines checked, navigation equipment tested. Charts were reviewed, courses plotted, and then when everything was ready and the weather window looked favorable, they would slip out of Scalloway Harbor, usually in the evening or at night, and head east into the North Sea. The first hours were usually the easiest. Close to Shetland, the water was relatively sheltered and the boat could make good progress. But as they moved farther from land, the conditions typically worsened. The North Sea swells would build and the small boat would begin its characteristic motion, rising and falling, pitching and rolling. Passengers who were not sailors would usually become seasick. Leif would remain at the helm, steering, constantly adjusting the boat's heading to take the waves at the best angle. As dawn approached, vigilance increased. Daylight meant visibility, and visibility meant danger. German patrol aircraft might spot them. German warships might appear. Sometimes they saw German vessels at a distance and had to alter course, hoping they hadn't been noticed. Sometimes they encountered German patrols and had to run, pushing the boat to its maximum speed, zigzagging, hoping the Germans wouldn't hit them and that their smaller size and better knowledge of the waters would let them escape. The Norwegian coast would eventually appear, usually as a dark line on the horizon that slowly resolved into the distinctive profiles of headlands and islands. But reaching the coast was only the beginning of the next challenge. The landing point was usually in a remote location up a narrow fjord or in a hidden cove. Navigation required precision, especially if the approach was made at night or in fog. Landmarks had to be identified correctly, channels and passages threaded carefully. Landing was always tense. Even if the location seemed secure, there was always the possibility that the Germans had discovered it, that soldiers were waiting in ambush. Leif and his crew would approach cautiously, looking for the signals that indicated it was safe to land, ready to reverse course and flee if anything seemed wrong. If all was well, the real work began. Cargo was unloaded, working quickly but carefully in darkness. Passengers departed or boarded. Intelligence was exchanged, news shared in hurried conversations. And then, as quickly as possible, the boat would leave, beginning the dangerous journey back to Shetland. The return crossing was often harder. The crew was tired now. The boat might be riding differently if it had taken on passengers. And they always had to worry about whether German forces had learned of the incursion and were waiting for them. But return they did, crossing after crossing, mission after mission. Between missions there was maintenance work on the boats, planning sessions, brief periods of rest. And then another mission would come, and Leif would put to sea again. If summer crossings were dangerous, winter crossings were nearly suicidal. The North Sea in winter is one of the world's most hostile environments. Gales sweep out of the north and west with frightening regularity. The water temperature drops to just above freezing. Days are short, with less than 6 hours of dim daylight in midwinter, meaning most of each crossing was made in darkness. Ice could form on the boat's superstructure, creating dangerous instability. Waves could grow to monstrous sizes. The casualty rate for Shetland bus operations was highest in winter. Boats were lost to storms more often than to enemy action. Crews faced conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. Yet Leif continued to sail. When other skippers questioned whether a crossing was possible, Leif would study the weather, think carefully, and often decide to go. His success rate remained extraordinary. He seemed to possess an ability to find windows in the weather that others couldn't see, to push through conditions that would have stopped most sailors. There were close calls, certainly. There were crossings where the boat was battered by waves so large they seemed like moving mountains, where ice built up on the deck and had to be chipped away constantly to prevent capsizing, where engines faltered and had to be coaxed back to life while the boat wallowed helplessly in heavy seas. There were times when even Leif must have wondered if this crossing would be his last. But he always made it through. and after each successful mission his legend grew a little more. The Shetland bus operations exacted a heavy toll. Of the boats that participated in the operation, many were lost. Of the men who crewed them, many never returned. The sea claimed some, German weapons claimed others. Brave sailors set out on missions and simply vanished, their fate unknown, their final moments unrecorded except by the indifferent waters that swallowed them. Leif saw comrades die. He saw boats disappear. He attended memorial services for men with whom he had sailed. Each loss must have weighed on him, must have made the next mission harder to begin. Yet he continued. What drove him? Perhaps it was a sense of duty to his occupied homeland. Perhaps it was loyalty to the resistance fighters who depended on the supplies and support he delivered. Perhaps it was stubborn Norwegian determination not to yield to impossible odds. Probably it was all of these things and more. But whatever his motivations, Leif never spoke of them much. He was not a man given to grand statements or philosophical musings. He was a sailor who had a job to do, and he did it, crossing after crossing, mission after mission, through storm and danger, through summer and winter, through the long years of the war. As the war progressed, Leif Larsen's achievements began to receive official recognition. The Norwegian government in exile decorated him multiple times. The British recognized his service as well. By the war's end, he would become one of the most highly decorated Allied servicemen of the entire conflict. He received the Distinguished Service Order, the Distinguished Service Cross with 2 bars, the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, and the Distinguished Service Medal. The Norwegian government awarded him the War Cross with 3 swords and the War Medal, among other honors. No other Norwegian serviceman received as many decorations. Yet Leif remained characteristically modest about these honors. To him, they were simply recognition for doing his job. He never boasted about his achievements, never sought fame or glory. When people praised his courage, he would typically deflect the praise, noting that many others had been equally brave, that he had simply been lucky. This modesty was typical of the man. Despite his extraordinary achievements, despite becoming one of the legendary figures of the Norwegian resistance, Leif remained fundamentally unchanged. He was still the sailor from Valor, still the man who found his meaning in the work itself rather than in recognition for it. By 1943, the Shetland bus operations were evolving. The casualty rate among the fishing boats, particularly in winter, had become unsustainable. The British Admiralty made available 3 motor torpedo boats, fast, powerful craft specifically designed for coastal operations. These vessels, Hitra, Vigra, and Hesse, named for Norwegian islands, could make the crossing faster, could better defend themselves if attacked, and had a much better chance of surviving bad weather. Leif Larsen took command of one of these new boats, and the character of the Shetland bus changed. Now missions could be conducted more quickly and with less risk. The MTBS could outrun most German patrol craft and could fight if they couldn't run. They were better suited to the harsh conditions of the North Sea. But even with these improved vessels, the work remained dangerous. The Germans were intensifying their coastal defenses, increasing patrols, fortifying the Norwegian coast, and the MTBS, while more capable than fishing boats, were still vulnerable to the North Sea's fury. Leif adapted to the new vessels with his characteristic competence. He learned their capabilities and limitations, learned how to extract maximum performance from them while keeping crew and cargo safe. And he continued his missions, now sometimes commanding small flotillas of boats on larger operations. One mission stands out as exemplary of Leif's skill and courage. In November 1943, he commanded an operation to land a group of saboteurs near Bergholm on the Norwegian coast. The mission was critical. These men were to conduct operations against German installations, but the weather was appalling. The North Sea was generating huge swells, and visibility was nearly zero in driving snow and sleet. Most commanders would have postponed the mission, waiting for better conditions. But the saboteurs needed to be in position by a specific date, and Leif decided the mission could be accomplished. The crossing was harrowing. The MTB battled through mountainous seas, was tossed like a toy by the waves, took water over the bow again and again. The crew was battered and exhausted. Navigation was extremely difficult, with few visible landmarks and constant spray obscuring what little visibility there was. But Leif found his way. Using a combination of dead reckoning, brief glimpses of landmarks, and his intimate knowledge of these waters, he brought the boat to the correct landing point. The saboteurs were successfully put ashore, and Leif brought his boat and crew safely back to Shetland. The mission was successful. The saboteurs completed their objectives, and once again Shetlands Larsen had demonstrated the extraordinary skill and determination that made him a legend. Through 1943 and 1944, the missions continued. The tempo of operations increased as the Allies prepared for the eventual liberation of Europe. Resistance movements throughout occupied Europe, including in Norway, were being armed and organized, preparing to support the Allied advance when it came. The Shetland bus played a crucial role in this preparation. Weapons, explosives, and equipment flowed into Norway in increasing quantities. Agents were inserted and extracted. Intelligence was gathered. The hidden war against the occupation continued and intensified. For Leif, the work became routine in one sense. He was now a veteran of dozens of successful missions, and what had once seemed impossibly dangerous now felt like hard but familiar work. Yet each mission was still unique, still presented its own challenges, and the danger never diminished. The North Sea never became truly safe. The Germans never stopped trying to intercept the Shetland bus boats, and every crossing still required skill, vigilance, and luck. He continued to sail, continued to bring men and materials safely across, continued to confound the odds. Other skippers came and went, but Shetlands Larsen remained a constant presence, the man who could be counted on when the mission was most dangerous or most critical. On May 7, 1945, German forces in Norway surrendered following the general capitulation of Nazi Germany. After 5 long years, Norway was free. For Leif Larsen, the moment must have been overwhelming. He had fought through the entire war, had made more than 50 crossings of the North Sea, had faced death countless times. He had seen comrades die, had endured conditions that would have broken most men, had kept going when every rational calculation suggested he should have failed long ago. And now it was over. Norway was free. The missions were complete. The Shetland bus had been an extraordinary success. Despite the dangers and the losses, the operation had maintained a link between occupied Norway and Free Britain throughout the war. It had supplied the resistance, evacuated hundreds of refugees, inserted agents and commandos, and gathered vital intelligence. And no one had contributed more to this success than Leif Larsen. After the war, Leif returned to Norway and to civilian life. He had left Norway as a merchant sailor and returned as one of his nation's greatest heroes. The decorations, the recognition, the gratitude of his countrymen, all were genuine and deeply felt. But Leif was not a man transformed by fame. He returned to the sea and to sailing, which had always been his true calling. He commanded Norwegian merchant vessels, traveling the world's oceans, doing the work he had always loved. He married and had a family. He became a respected figure in Norwegian maritime circles, though he remained characteristically modest about his wartime achievements. When asked about the war years, he would speak matter-of-factly about the work, without heroics or drama. To him, he had simply done his job. He maintained connections with fellow Shetland bus veterans, with the men who had shared those dangerous years. These bonds, forged in the crucible of war and the harsh waters of the North Sea, remained strong throughout his life. As the years passed and the wartime generation aged, Leif Larsen's achievements gained a kind of legendary status. Books were written about the Shetland bus operations, and Leif featured prominently in all of them. He became, in the Norwegian national memory, the exemplar of a certain kind of courage. Quiet, determined, unshowy, but utterly reliable. Museums in both Norway and Shetland preserve the history of the Shetland bus operations. Boats similar to those used in the war are maintained and displayed. Memorials honor those who died in the operations. And in all these remembrances, Leif Larsen occupies a central place. Yet even as his legend grew, the man himself remained grounded. He never sought the spotlight, never traded on his fame. He was content with his life, with his family, with his work at sea. The medals and honors were appreciated, certainly, but they were not the measure of his life. What mattered to him, it seems, was the work itself, the satisfaction of a job well done, the respect of fellow sailors, the knowledge that he had served his country and helped preserve its freedom. These were enough. Leif Andreas Larsen died on October 12, 1990, at the age of 84. He had lived a full life, had seen Norway occupied and liberated, had witnessed enormous changes in the world and in his country. He had been a sailor in the age of sail and had lived to see satellites and computers revolutionize navigation. He had fought in a war unlike any before or since, and had lived through the long peace that followed. His passing was noted with respect and sadness in Norway, and among those who knew the history of the Shetland bus. Obituaries recounted his extraordinary achievements, the missions, the decorations, the lives saved and resistance supported by his courage and skill. But perhaps the best measure of Leif Larsen's life is not in the medals or the statistics, impressive though they are. Rather, it is in the simple fact that when the situation was most desperate, when the mission was most dangerous, when the weather was most foul and the odds most hopeless, he could be counted on to say yes, to prepare his boat, and to sail into the North Sea darkness once again. This reliability, this steadiness in the face of danger, This determination to do what needed to be done regardless of the personal cost. These are the qualities that made Leif Larsen exceptional. Today, if you travel to Shetland, you can visit the Scalloway Museum where the history of the Shetland bus is preserved and told. You can see photographs of the boats and the men who sailed them. You can see artifacts from the operations, weapons, equipment, personal effects. You can read about the missions, the successes, and the tragedies. And if you stand on the shore and look east toward Norway, look out over the gray waters of the North Sea, you can try to imagine what it was like. Imagine a small boat pushing through heavy seas in winter darkness. Imagine cold spray freezing as it hits the deck. Imagine the constant motion, the engine's roar, the endless vigilance required to navigate safely. Imagine doing this not once but dozens of times, knowing that each crossing could be your last. Imagine, and perhaps you can begin to understand the measure of what Leif Larsen and his comrades achieved. The North Sea is still there, still cold, still capable of sudden fury, still demanding respect from those who sail upon it. The waters remember nothing, of course. The sea is indifferent to human affairs, to courage and sacrifice, to history itself. But we remember. We remember the boats that cross those waters carrying hope and freedom. We remember the men who sailed them. And we remember especially one man who crossed those waters more times than any other, who became known by the simple telling name of Shetlands Larsen. Leif Larsen's legacy extends beyond the specific achievements of the Shetland bus operations, significant as those were. He became a symbol of Norwegian resistance, of the determination of small nations to resist tyranny, of the importance of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. His story reminds us that heroism often looks different from the dramatic depictions we see in films. Leif's heroism was not about grand gestures or dramatic moments, but about showing up day after day, mission after mission, and doing difficult, dangerous work to the best of his ability. It was about reliability, competence, and the willingness to face danger repeatedly for a cause greater than himself. He also exemplifies a certain kind of humility. Despite his achievements, despite becoming one of the most decorated Allied servicemen of the war, he never sought glory or special treatment. He returned to civilian life and ordinary work with the same dedication he had brought to his wartime service. He remained connected to the sailor's craft that had always been his calling. In a world that often celebrates self-promotion and personal branding, Leif Larsen's quiet dignity stands as a reminder that true worth is not measured by how loudly we proclaim our achievements, but by the quality and integrity of our actions. The bond between Shetland and Norway, already strong before the war due to historical and cultural connections, was strengthened immeasurably by the Shetland bus operations. Shetlanders risked their own safety by supporting the operations, providing harbor for the boats, maintaining security, and offering assistance to Norwegian refugees. This connection persists today. The islands maintain close ties with regular ferries connecting them. Cultural exchanges are common, and the memory of the Shetland bus remains a living link between the communities, a shared history of cooperation in the darkest of times. Leif Larsen is remembered in Shetland as warmly as in his native Norway. His success reflected not just his own skill, but the support and cooperation he received from the Shetland community. The legacy is shared, a reminder that freedom is often preserved by cooperation across borders, by people of different nations working together toward common goals. As we conclude our story, it is worth reflecting on what Leif Larsen's life might teach us today. His story occurred in a specific historical moment, in the unique circumstances of World War II. Yet certain aspects of his character and achievement seem timeless. He demonstrated the importance of expertise, of mastering a craft so thoroughly that one can perform at the highest level, even under terrible conditions. His years of peacetime sailing prepared him for his wartime service in ways he could never have anticipated. The lesson is clear. There is value in developing skills deeply, in truly mastering one's profession, because we never know when that expertise might be critically needed. He showed the power of persistence. Success in the Shetland bus operations was not about one heroic mission, but about dozens of them, about showing up again and again, about continuing even when exhausted, even when friends had been lost, even when the odds seemed impossible. Great achievements are often the product not of single moments of brilliance, but of sustained effort over time. He exemplified humility. Despite his fame, he never lost sight of what was truly important. He understood that medals and recognition, while nice, were not the point. The point was doing the work, serving the cause, helping others. In our age of social media and constant self-promotion, this humility feels both rare and valuable, and perhaps most importantly, he demonstrated moral courage. He could have sat out the war safely. After escaping to Britain, he could have found comfortable war work far from danger. Instead, he chose repeatedly to put himself in harm's way because it was the right thing to do, because his country and the cause of freedom needed him too. And so we come to the end of our story about Leif Larsen, Shetlands Larsen, the Norwegian sailor who became one of the great heroes of the Second World War. We have followed him from his childhood in the Valor Islands, through his development as a master sailor, through the dark years of occupation and resistance, and finally to his peaceful life after the war and his death in 1990. It is a story worth remembering, worth telling again to new generations. Not because it glorifies war. There is nothing glorious about war, about the loss of life, about the suffering and sacrifice it demands. Rather, it is worth remembering because it shows what human beings are capable of when challenged, how ordinary people can rise to extraordinary circumstances, how courage and skill and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Tonight, as we prepare to rest, we can take comfort in knowing that when darkness threatened to engulf freedom, when tyranny seemed unstoppable, there were people like Leif Larsen who refused to accept defeat. They went out onto dark waters in small boats and kept hope alive through their courage and dedication. They remind us that even in the darkest times, light persists, carried by those brave enough to bear it. Sleep well, knowing that the sea still rolls under the stars, that the coast of Norway stands proud and free, and that the memory of Shetlands Larsen and his comrades endures, a beacon reminding us of the power of quiet courage and steadfast determination. The story is told, the hero rests, and we rest too, grateful for the freedom they secured, inspired by the example they set. Good night.